Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar from Cerebration. We are going to be delving deep into change management today. This is an area that I've been really interested in for a long time and been a qualified change manager. A lot of what we're going to be going through today is looking at the change process. We're going to be looking at the psychological process of change and transition and the difference between them. And we're going to be applying a framework called whole brain thinking to that framework to change itself. We're also going to look at the different personas that we could relate to change and essentially see how you can support people through change through useful tools and very practical applications. So let's get started. I will have the chat on as well. So if anyone has any messages, do feel free to leave them in the comments. I will be checking through as we go through the webinar, and I will do my best to answer any questions that people might have at the end of the workshop as well. So let me bring up today's presentation. So for those of you who don't know me, hi, I am Jamie Beekov Brett from Cerebration. Cerebration is an organization that I set up 5 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. Essentially, what we do is we help organizations have better thinking to get better results. And the framework that we're going to be going through is so versatile that we can really apply it to anything. Change is just one of the methodologies that we could use to apply it, but there's lots of things that we could apply it to. So we really help teams and organizations to decode the different ways that they think. This could be through the way that they interact with each other. This could be through communications, but essentially we're taking that framework and applying it to a range of different organizational challenges. And that's what I like about it is once you understand it, you can really apply it to anything. So, as I said, Cerebration helps organizations with better thinking to get better results. I'm a human centric innovator. So, being able to have methodologies that help us to understand the way that we think and apply it to the world around us is really helpful. What's really useful about this framework is it's a metaphorical model. It helps us to understand the way that we think and others think and be able to come up with a formula to be able to connect together. So, into change, and I think you've probably all heard the statistic at some point. If not, where have you been? Because it's such an important one. A recent study found that 30% of change projects fail to really reach their intended benefits. And there's so many reasons behind that. We're going to dig into it in a bit more detail. But what this means is that 30% of change projects achieving their intended benefits means that they've most organizations who have tried to reach a particular point in time, who have undergone this change for a reason, have failed to be able to realize the reason why they started it to begin with. And that is very concerning. And that means there's a lot of time, energy, and resources that are wasted because we never really realized the benefits of why we started the change in the first place. So, what are some of the main challenges that impact us when we're managing change? Well, the first one is around the metrics. When we're looking at things, if we're looking at it from a very ROI perspective, we don't always necessarily agree with the reasons that we're undergoing the change to begin with. You have to get buy in to get people to go, you know what, I understand the value of this change. It could be as well that the processes that are unclear, how you're going to get from point A to point B, isn't really laid out. It's ambiguous. It doesn't necessarily look at the intervention points along the way. And once again, maybe doesn't lead people on that change process in a way that's meaningful to those individuals. One of the most important aspects of change is that everybody has to feel that they have a part to play within that change. And if they don't agree with the plan, if it doesn't make sense to them, if they don't have buy in to the process that they're going through, then the likelihood is they're not going to feel that they have a part to play in that change, which means that they're less likely to engage with the wider change process. Another one is emotional resistance. We all have resistance to all of the different things that happen in our life, but change is one of those ones that really resonates with us on a core level. We react to change as if we're being attacked by a wild dog. We have a visceral nature to reaction to change because essentially it threatens our security. It threatens all of the things that are important within our world, and that can be really challenging. So we often resist it from an emotional perspective. And we're going to look at some of those emotions that we feel on our change journey as we go through. And the other one can be that change often can be just flicking between two models. I know of organizations that for the last decade and a half have essentially been going through the same restructure between two different models every 18 months. And they'll go through the change process, they'll go through the restructure, they'll go through all the different processes they've gone through, and then they'll come out the other side of it and go, you know what? I think we should go back to the next model. Or a new leader comes in and goes, you know what? That model doesn't work for me. Let's go for this one. And therefore, their staff are in this constant state of change fatigue where they're just flicking between two different models, never really realizing the benefits that they started for either of them. So, what we have to understand is that there is a lot of pain points related to change. From our analytical perspective, it could be inefficiencies. It could be the fact that we're wasting resources when we're going through change, because change does take a lot of resources, not just material resources, but emotional resources, staff resources, consultant fee resources. All of these things can be inefficient if our change is not done in the right way. We also end up with lots of delays. When we shake the system, when we shake our models, when we shake different ways of working, we essentially put ourselves back to square one. And therefore, what's going to happen is people need to relearn things. People need to be able to approach it from a different angle. People need to learn the new way of doing things, which means we never really reach the efficiency that we had potentially prior to the change, because we don't necessarily, when change is going on, we don't necessarily have that same understanding that we did in the previous one. Going back to our emotional resilience and our emotional factors, that's one of the scary points for people when they're undergoing change. Is if you know what you're doing and you're happy with what you're doing, and somebody comes to you and says, I need you to change the way that you're doing, all of the security that you have in the knowledge of being able to do that process goes out the window. And that's a scary thing for a lot of people. Change also, because of that impact, has a huge it has a huge cost to morale. So what happens is that as people are going through this process, they're feeling the emotional drain. They are going to go through processes where they might be colleagues' roles might be changing, their roles might be changing, the organization might be changing, things that they were quite happy with, that were quite settled with, might be changing as well. And that often causes us to feel down, feel blue, feel that this isn't part of a process that we want to be through. And that's where a lot of organizations lose talented people along the way, because someone goes, you know what, I'm out, guys. I don't believe in this change anymore. And the only way I can show that is by not participating in it any further. The next one is missed opportunities. So, as we said, only 30% of those change projects realize their intended benefits. Now, that means that we've got 70% of change projects that never reach the benefits that they intended to do. This might be that when they're implementing the change, the system doesn't have all of the things they were hoping for, or the structure doesn't realize the benefits that they were hoping for. There could be a range of different things that are missed opportunities that happen as part of this change. And also, it might be that what is important to one set of staff is very different than what's important to another set of staff. So they might feel that the change has been beneficial for one group, but might have been detrimental to them. So the first model I want to introduce you to is something called the change curve. This was initially from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was actually studying people who had um, a were facing essentially death. They were Her study was looking at people as they had a terminal diagnosis and the reactions they went through, and that might go, oh, that seems a bit of a strong one for change. But actually, it's really beneficial because this isn't a process. This process just shows how we adapt to all change as well. So, although Elizabeth Kubler-Ross originally studied it within terminal patients, what we actually notice is we're constantly going through this change curve. And it's really worth noting that we're never just going on one change curve at the same time. We might be going on one change curve for work. We might be going on another change curve for something else. We might have another change curve for our family life. And sometimes you've got all of these change curves that we're going on. It's really hard to identify which one we might be on at any given point. But let's have a look at this model and you'll understand it because you've probably seen very similar things in the past. But it's a really useful way to understand the psychological process of change that people are going through. I've also called it the transition curve over the change curve, or put that in brackets, because I feel it measures transition better than it does change, but we'll come on to why that is a little bit later. So, the first reaction we have to change is often shock. We've just heard about this change. I don't know how to react to it. It's scary. There's anxiety. There is ambiguity. Really unclear what's going to happen next, but they're just shocked. Why would they want to change things? Things have been going great. I've really enjoyed the job. This has been working really well for me. So our first reaction is always a bit of something's going to change. And that just immediately sends us into a state of anxiety because we know change is coming, but we don't know what that change is. This is normally shortly followed by denial. You've seen this all the time. I bet within your organization you've experienced this, where change is going and everyone goes, you know what? It'll never happen. They say they're going to do this, but it won't happen. They've promised this kind of change before. I'm pretty sure I was in a meeting 10 years ago where they spoke about this change, and it's, it didn't happen then. Why is it going to happen now? So our initial thing is we deny the reality. There's a resistance to it. It's easier to be able to go, nope, I don't believe in that, than it is to be able to start to kind of accept that actually something might be going on that's a bit different. What you also notice is there generally tends to be a bit of a rise in energy. So if we're looking at this graph at the moment, we're looking at the emotional toll on the left-hand side as we're going on our x-axis. But if we're going across our y-axis, we're looking across time. And what you can see is actually there's a little bit of an elevated emotion when it comes to that denial point, which might seem a bit strange, but that's often because people go to a state of trying to prove that the change isn't going to happen. This might be that they go, you know what, this has worked really well. If I work a little bit harder, I'll just prove that the change isn't needed. This new system that they're bringing in, don't know if it's even relevant to me. Like, I'm just going to work really hard. And if I work really hard, they're probably going to go, well, there's probably no need for this change. It also might be that there's an energy of confusion. So people kind of go, well, I'm just going to dive into my work. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing and kind of bury my head in the sand a little bit. You can also, depending on the individual, this could also be a point of happiness. Sometimes people go, oh my God, something's going to change. Or they've said something's going to change. I'm really excited about that. I don't know what that change is, but it sounds like it could be good. So there is often this elevated moment as soon as we hear about change. Then we start to go through some of the other emotions as we come to accepting this change. So this could be that we're angered, that we're threatened, that we feel the victim of the change. Why are they doing this to me? I've always been a good person. If everybody worked the same way that I did in an organization, we'd all be fine. That often is when we start to accept things and we start to go, wait a second, we're pointing the finger everywhere. We might go, you know what, I'm going to blame other people for this. If everyone worked harder, we'd be fine. And then there might be a bit of self-blame going, you know what, maybe I haven't worked as hard in the last year, or maybe I have been caught up in a few different things. So you start to blame yourself for the change. Then there might be a bit of resistance to the change going, well, it might not be as exciting as it was. And you can see that we're really going down in this emotional energy level, all the way to the point of depression. This is our depression peak, where we kind of go, sorry, a depression valley. And this is where essentially we're absorbed into the lowest point that we're going to feel as part of this change process. It's ambiguous. We haven't seen any benefits. We know something's going to happen. That's where it becomes quite a challenging situation for us. But then as we start to accept the change a little bit further, but also start experimenting with the change, we start going, you know what, this change might be all right. We can go, yeah, I'm going to let go of the past. I'm going to explore what they're showing me. I might be able to, go and practice on a system or go and talk to people about it. And I'm going to start to really, see if this changes for me. Maybe it's not as bad as it's going to look like. Then, and actually, maybe there's going to be some benefits to it as well. Then we come to our decision point. And this is where we can continue going on the curve, but a lot of people get off the ride at this point. So this decision point is where we go, you know what, this change does look like it's for me, or I am going to engage with it, or it doesn't look like it's for me. And this is why a lot of the time you'll see, voluntary redundancies. Sometimes a lot of organizations that put that available for people often withdraw it as part of the change process because they have so many people that have either left or put themselves up for voluntary redundancies that it's more than what they were expecting. So that decision point shows us that actually people don't buy into the change at all. People don't believe in this new future. and they want to be able to move on to the next thing. So they're not going to engage with this process any further. And then finally, we have problem solving and engagement. So this is where we're going to start to engage with the change process. We're going to start to buy into it. We feel knowledgeable enough about what that is that we can consent to being part of this process. So this is really our change journey, the experiences and emotions that we go through when we react to any change. Hopefully, you can see yourself somewhere within this change process. So I've spoken a bit about the model that we're going to be utilizing today, and it's called the whole brain model. So the whole purpose of this model is it's a metaphorical model that helps us to think about the different ways of thinking in order to take a more holistic approach. It works because people have a different way that they perceive information and they have different preferences to how they assimilate that information, make decisions, and solve problems. Now, yes, this is a metaphorical model, not a biological model. The whole purpose of metaphorical models is to help us to think about our thinking in a way that's beneficial. So if we cut your brain open, it's not going to split itself nicely into four different colors. But what you would find is that if we measure people's preferences, they people will have different preferences for each of these different quadrants. So our blue quadrant is our analytical quadrant, really trying to figure the answer to what. It's looking at the facts, the return on investments, the financial figures. All of this is our kind of analytical space. So it's trying to figure out the answer to what's going to happen. Our green quadrant is our practical quadrant. This is looking at step-by-step processes. This is looking at how are you going to get from point A to point B, and that's really what it's trying to find the answer to is how. We have our relational quadrant, which is looking at people. So it's looking at who's going to be affected, who's it going to be, who do I need to support on this process, how are other people feeling? So it's trying to figure out the answer to who. And we also have our experimental quadrant. So this is more of our big picture thinking, innovative approaches. They're really trying to figure out the answer to why. And we can apply this very nicely to change. So just before I do that, let's go into a little bit more detail on this model. So, we've got our blue quadrant, our technical, our financial, our facts, our green quadrant, our organization, our detail, in a single word, looking at the form, the way that we form these ideas. Our red quadrant is kind of looking at that emotional, sensory, and the people centric considerations. So that's our feeling self. And we've also got our yellow quadrant, which is looking at our risk taking, our intuition, our big picture. So, what's the future going to look like? And if we apply that to change, we really come up with a nice way of taking a holistic approach, which means we're going to answer the key considerations for each part of this model. So if we're looking at our blue quadrant, we could go, you know what, they want to find out the answer to what. So what I need as part of this change process is to show them the data analysis, maybe the research behind it. I need to inform them what the new metrics are going to be. What's the important way that we're going to measure success within the organization? It could also look at those success rates. What does success look like within this new vision? And also some benchmarking to be able to go, what does good look like? How can we make sure that we know what good looks like in this new vision? Then we've got our green quadrant. So this could be things like project plans, step-by-step guides. Essentially they want to be able to have the structure to understand how's this change going to happen. And this is really important. A lot of people announce change and then don't tell people what the plan is. They just tell them that things are going to change and they've got some idea of what that's going to look like, but they haven't got really the details at this particular point. No, we need this for our greens. We need to make sure that we have those roles and responsibilities, we have those timelines, that people understand how we expect people to get from this point to the next point. For our reds, what we really want to be looking at is our communication skills, our empathy, how people are going to be impacted by it. So everybody knows who's going to be impacted, how they're going to be impacted, what kind of support is going to be available. Quite often, leaders announce a change too early because they haven't figured out the rest of the stuff, but they're already on this change journey. And they're like, well, we need to tell people that this change is going to happen. And they do it before having the answers to go, this is the support that we're going to put in place. This is the personal impact. This is our communication plan. And that can be really challenging for people. And for our yellows, we really want to understand why this is happening. So how can we make sure that this is an innovative approach? How can we ensure that we're mitigating risks along the way, but also that there's some risk taking that can happen? What's the big picture vision? Help me buy into this vision of our future state and what it looks like. And what's the long term goals that happen because of this big change that we're undertaking? I like this image because I feel like it summarizes something very well. Who wants to lead, who wants change? Lots of people. Who wants to actually change? Not so many people. And who wants to lead the change? And it's an invisible audience. And I feel that this is very reflective. And this is because change is all down to leadership. It really is. A lot of what we're going to look at the moment is some of the biggest challenges, but really the defining factor of successful change is how the change is led. That's why where we look at our elected leaders, we measure them onto the success of helping us to transition into different world. So if it's, we've just had an election here in the UK, new prime minister comes in, what they've done is gone, what, the change that was promised from the previous government hasn't happened. The new government has promised this kind of change. I have to decide if I want to be able to buy into that change, and I have to decide if I want to buy into the leader who is managing that change. And that is really interesting. And that doesn't just go from a national level, but also happens from an organizational level as well. So, this is some of the most important points that we have to think about when it comes to what are the main causes of failed change. The main one that I see for a lot of organizations is that leaders don't recognize that they're further along the change curve than the people that they're communicating to. So if you think about leaders who have decided to make this change, quite often they start it, they have lots of conversations around it, they have a really good idea of what it's going to look like, and they've started going through that emotional process. So they've gone through their shock, they've gone through their acceptance. Maybe they're in that kind of bit of acceptance, moving through to depression, even maybe experimenting with that new future. The problem is the people that they've communicated it to are at the very beginning of that change process. So they're just going through a whole set of different emotions. And while the leadership is trying to, engage with this new future and realize the benefits, the people that they're talking to have just started that process. And then what often that means is that leaders get fatigued in that role because they go, well, I'm already through this and I've been at this stage of accepting this new future for such a long time, and everyone else is just dragging their feet. Why hasn't everyone come along? I feel that I'm here. Why doesn't everybody feel that they're there? And that can be really difficult for leaders to understand that people are going through that change at a different rate than they are. Another one is leaders often think training instead of change management. This is the biggest problem that I see with organizations. They often come up to me and go, we want some training to be able to help us with this change, or we need this intervention from a training perspective to help us on this change process. And they basically consider the training to be change management, and it's not. Training is an intervention that happens at a certain point on the change process. Training isn't going to help people in those early stages of the change process when they're going through those emotions of loss, rejection, depression, bargaining, all of this kind of stuff. That's not going to help those people in these early stages of the change process. So training isn't going to help. Training helps us at the end of that change process when people are starting to experiment with that new future and want to be able to gain knowledge of what it's going to be. That's when training is helpful to us. But training itself is not the same as change management. You can't just stick a training session in there and think that that's going to solve your change process. Change fatigue can also have real little a little recognition when it comes to the psychological process. So we have change fatigue. Quite often people are going change after change after change after change. It's exhausting. You're never really realizing the benefits, and you stay in a constant state of feeling that everything's just changing all the time. You never settle into a status quo, and that can be really difficult, as well as there being a little recognition for that psychological process of transition. So when we're looking at change, we're looking at it as a journey, as loads of different intervention points. Whereas the psychological process of transition, that doesn't happen on a schedule. You can't plan that in. What happens with transition is that takes time, and that happens on a very individual basis based on that individual's experiences and ways of working. This is also probably one of the biggest reasons that change projects fail, and it kind of relates to the first point that we started with, which is leaders pull away the change support and resources too early on the journey. What happens is the leaders go, well, we've been on this journey for a long time. It looks like people are beginning to experiment with this future. There's less resistance than there was earlier. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull away the extra support we put in place. I'm going to change the flexibility we had. I'm going to take away, some of the changes that we might have made in targets in order to be able to get people on board with this process. And then they go, we're just going to put it back now. We're going to put everything should be at the status quo. And actually, they do this at the point when people have just started to experiment with this process. They've just started to experiment with this new future, and now the resources have been pulled away too early. So it's really important that we want to be getting to a point that we're actually realizing the benefits of this change and have been consistently for a while before we start to pull away resources and support that we've put in place to help people on the change process. So, you saw earlier I said a little bit about the difference between change and transition. So, change is the actual events, activities, and steps that can be put into a diary or a project plan in order to support people. So, that is essentially what we manage. We are change managers. We can put in the intervention points. So we can decide when training is going to happen. We can decide when we're going to have change agents come in place. We're going to decide when the resource guides come out. But what we can't control in the same way is transition, which is the human psychological process of letting go of one pattern and engaging with a new one. The better we manage our change process, the quicker people will go through that transition. The poorer we manage that change process, the longer that transition will take. William Bridges is a person who makes this distinction quite well, which is that transition is the natural process of disorientation and reorientation that marks the turning point in the path of growth. Transitions are key times in the natural process of self renewal. So, one really important factor we want to do when we're supporting people through transition is to think about cognitive inclusion and psychological safety. So, cognitive inclusion is going based on that model that we looked at. Have we got something for everyone on that journey? Have we made sure we've taken a holistic approach that means that everybody feels that based on what their preferences might be, they have the data that they need in order to feel included within this process? And that helps build what we call psychological safety. So, this is where we can essentially support people because they feel safe enough in the environment in order to be able to participate and engage with the process. So I'm going to give you some personas to be able to look at. Ben Blue, he's my personification of our blue quadrant in whole brain thinking. He says to us, you know what, as an analyst, I struggle with the understanding of these new metrics being introduced. I need clear data and explanations in order to adapt quickly to what's happening on. Ben Blue really focused on the fact, really focused on the bottom line. And you probably all know a Ben Blue in your life. They're probably someone who sends quite frequently one sentence emails that goes, you know what, I just need to be able to have this data that's in front of me. So it's really important we help them understand what success looks like in the future for our Ben Blue persona. Next, we have Gina Green. So Gina Green is a project manager. She says, I find the lack of processes frustrating. We need a step-by-step plan in order to implement changes smoothly. What's really important for Gina is she has that understanding of the timeline, the process, how we're going to get to point A to point B. And that needs to be communicated. There needs to be the resources to support people on that change process through very clear plans. Next, we have Roger Red. Roger Red is a team member, feels anxious about the changing. It wants to understand how these changes impact them personally and also impact the teams that they're working in. And that would help them be able to ease the transition. It's really important that we recognize not just what people are going to gain through the change process, but all change comes with a sense of loss, even if that sense of loss is just confidence in what we're doing. But that change process has to acknowledge that we all have to mourn our previous reality in order to be able to engage with the next reality. One thing you might want to think about here is how you celebrate potentially what's happened in the past, not as a way to, the way that things used to be done still deserve celebration, still deserve recognition. You're not saying to people, hey, you weren't performing, this wasn't good, we didn't like the way that the organization was. You could go, you know what, the way we were doing things served us for that time, but it's not going to serve us moving into the future. So you might want to even think about throwing a party, throwing something that acknowledges the past, and in order to be able to help people to engage with the future. So a really nice thing that we can do there, really focusing on that recognition of personal loss when it comes to change. Next, we have Yara Yellow. So, as a strategist, the lack of innovative approaches or missed opportunities are going to be really annoying. If this change process seems like much of the same, just done in a different way, that's going to be frustrating for our yellows. What our yellows want to be able to see is go, not only is this change process a good thing, and it's going to bring new ways of being able to do things that are exciting, that is better than what we had before. So, they want to be able to explore these new ideas in order to be able to stay ahead. So one way is that we spoke about cognitive inclusion. I want to look at cognitive exclusion. We do this all the time without us knowing. What we generally tend to do is, because people have different preferences to us, we go, that person thinks differently to me. And because they think differently to me, and I know the way that I think is definitely right and definitely the best way of thinking, I must be correct and they must be wrong. So we might go, you know what, they're demonstrating this preference. I'm going to show you that it's actually not that important to me. It might be with our blues that we're going, they're cold, that they're critical, that they're not imaginative. With our greens, we might be going, they're always the micromanagers, they're overly cautious, they're boring, they're nitpicky. With our reds, we might go, they're touchy-feely bunch. They're unprofessional. They're too soft. They're overly emotional. And with our yellows, it might be that we're going, they're scatterbrained. They're impulsive. They're unrealistic. They're unreliable. And we're essentially saying this person thinks differently, and I don't like it. If we're going to cognitively include, we need to value the different ways of thinking and the different things that people bring to the table. And in order to do that, we can create psychological safety. So what we want to be able to do is make sure that we're doing these things in order to support the different color quadrants and the different preferences that people have. This, as we've spoken about a little bit, around measuring the impact, identifying those key metrics, assessing the return on investment, that's going to make the blues feel safe as part of this process. If we're looking at our greens, we want to be able to develop those clear policies. We want to ensure that we're being consistent throughout the process. Really important that everybody gets a fair shake of the stick as they go through. That this isn't a way that penalizes certain people over others. We want to make sure that we have the training process in place. That we have ways of assessing what's going on, and we have a way of understanding how this journey is going. From a red perspective, it's going to be around building trust, making sure that we are responsible, that people feel safe with us, that we communicate clearly with what our goals are, that we understand that there is differences of how people are going to go through that change process. And we want to be able to be inclusive of the different ways that people are participating and going through change. We want to be able to help our reds to be able to, feedback, give us that information. We want to encourage the channels that we need, because those are the best touch points for us to know if the change is succeeding or not, is to be able to get feedback back from people that are undergoing the process. The next is looking at our yellows. So this could be that we want to encourage some creativity. We definitely, at certain points of the change process, want to encourage them to experiment, and we need to be able to do that in a safe way. One thing you might want to consider doing is lowering targets when people are going through the change process. Because if you have the same targets at the beginning of the change process with the previous system, and you try to keep those going throughout your change process, what happens is people go, well, I'm just going to do things the old way because I know that that's how I can go and achieve those targets. And therefore, I don't want to experiment with the new way because that's going to be a risk to me. That could be a loss to me. That might mean that I don't reach those targets. So what we want to do in order to make sure people feel safe experimenting is to be able to provide that opportunity for people to experiment safely without consequences. We want them to engage in the new process. We might even want them to break the systems that we've implemented. We might want them to find out the different flaws of our new way of working. That's the best way that we can actually manage the failure of the project, because we have people that are engaging, experimenting, going, I think you thought this was going to work like this, but actually it works better like this. Or we might need to change that in order to be able to make this work. And that ties in nicely to some of that strategic thinking, that big picture vision that we might have for psychological safety. So, what can we do to help make sure that everybody feels that they have their key questions answered as part of this change process? With our blues, we want to make sure that we have clear objectives, that that we're tracking the progress, that we have analytical tools and metrics that help us to understand what's going on. With our greens, we want to make sure that there's that detailed plans, that everybody knows what their tasks are, that everybody feels that they have a role to play as part of that change and they know what that is. It might be that we have checklines in place. It might be that we have deadlines in place in order to be able to support them to understand what the process is that they're going through on this change journey. For our reds, it might be that we've got regular team meetings, that might be organizational, that might be team based, that might be one to ones. But in essentially, we want to make sure that people feel supported as part of that journey. This might be through feedback sessions, this might be through giving them emotional support, this might be from just acknowledging the feelings that they're going through, that this is a tricky time and it might not be what they expected, or it might have some difficult emotions that come up along the journey. Then we have our future vision. So when we're looking at our yellows, we want those vision statements. What's the vision? What's the mission? What's our values? What's our goals as part of this process? We want to see examples of it working, innovation where we say, what, this is our success stories. And if you're going through your change process, make sure that you pick up along the way what things have been successful. Anytime somebody engages with it and it engages in a positive way, let's go and share those success stories to make sure that everybody feels buy-in. And that can be really good from also coming up with case studies on the journey as well. We saw that this team did it in this way, and this is how beneficial it's going to be for this organization because this is what's happened because of it. So, but those case studies can be really useful as well. So that's the end of today's workshop. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found that there's a lot of resources and information in there. And also, it's taken you on a bit of a change journey of what change is like. I've got some free resources if people would like to learn more about whole brain thinking and some of the topics we've spoken about today. So if you'd like to measure your organization's approach to inclusion, visit cerebration.scoreapp.com. If you'd like to be able to look at resources, I produce weekly resource guides applying whole brain thinking to a different topic every week. You can follow our Instagram on instagram.com/cerebration edu, or follow our LinkedIn page. Go to linkedin.com company cerebration UK. You can also get a personalized analysis. So, if you want to understand how whole brain thinking might work for you, your organization, your sector, your team, just drop me a DM on LinkedIn, send me a message, and I'll produce you a little bit of a report to help you understand whole brain thinking that better, but a little bit better, and also applying it to you directly. And finally, if you want to catch up on any of our previous webinars, go to youtube.com at Cerebration Edu. And every time we've got one of these webinars, you will find that they are put on our YouTube channel as well. If you're interested in going through the journey to be able to learn a bit more about HBDI and apply HBDI to you, HBDI is essentially an assessment that takes whole brain thinking and applies it to you as a person so you can understand your own thinking preferences and also the thinking preferences of others. You can take that HBDI. Do feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and we can discuss in a bit more detail. And finally, if you'd like to go on that whole brain journey, this is what we generally do. So the first step is to take the HBDI, learn about yourself and how to apply whole brain thinking to you as an individual. Then we start to look at, potentially your team and come together of how we can apply whole brain thinking to your team and the work that you do. Then we start to look at how we can apply whole brain thinking to the challenges and topics that your organization works with. And then finally, it's about making sure that you know how to implement it. If you just do see this workshop today and that's the last time you think about whole brain thinking and you can't apply the framework to other things that are going on, then that's going to be a limitation. We want to make sure that you can see how whole brain thinking can be applied to literally anything. So thank you so much for your time, energy, participation on today's webinar. It's really great having you all here. Really appreciate it. If you would like to find out more or have any further conversations with myself or what Cerebration does, then send me a message at jamie@cerebration.uk. And if you have any questions, then I'm more than happy to answer them. But once again, thank you so much for your participation, and we'll catch you at a webinar very, very soon.